BFG. What you might remember is that the big friendly giant is now telling Sophie secrets about his big giant ears. So let's figure out what is happening. I is hearing little ants chittering to each other all over the scuttle around the soil. You mean you can hear ants talking? Every single word, said the BFG. Although I is not exactly understanding their language. Go on, Sophie said. Sometimes on a very clear night, the BFG said, and if I was swinging my ears in the right direction, and here he swivels his giant ears upward, so they're facing the ceiling. I is swiggling like them like this on a very clear night. I is sometimes hearing faraway music coming from the stars in the sky. A queer little shiver passed through Sophie's body. She sat very quiet, listening and waiting for more. My ears is what told me you was watching me out that window that night, the BFG said. But I didn't make a sound, Sophie said. I was hearing your heart beating across the road, the BFG said, loud as a drum. Go on, Sophie said, please. I can hear plants and trees. Do they talk? Sophie asked. They is not exactly talking, the BFG said, but they is making noises. For instance, if I come along and I is picking a lovely flower, if I is twisting the stem of the flower until it breaks, then the plant is screaming. How awful! You don't mean it. That's awful, Sophie cried. It is screaming just like you would be screaming if someone is twisting your arm right off. Is that really true? Sophie asked. You think I is swift-wiggling you? It is rather hard to believe. Then I is stopping right there, said the BFG sharply. I is not wishing to be called a fibster. Oh, no, I'm not calling you anything, Sophie cried. I believe you, I do, really. Please, go on. The BFG gave her a long, hard stare. Sophie looked right back at him, her face to his. I believe you, she said softly. She had offended him. She could see that. I won't ever be fibbling to you, he said. I know you wouldn't, Sophie said, but you must understand that it isn't easy to believe such an amazing thing straight away. I understand that, the BFG said. So please do forgive me and go on, she said. He waited a while longer. And then he said, it is the same with trees as it is with flowers. If I is chopping an axe into a tree trunk, I is hearing a terrible sound coming from inside the heart of the tree. What sort of sound? Sophie asked. A soft, moaning sound, the BFG said. It is like the sound of an old man is making when he is dying slowly. He paused. The cave was silent. Trees is living and growing, just like you and me, he said. They's alive. So is plants. He was sitting straight in his chair now, his hands clasped tightly together in front of him. His face was bright, his eyes round and bright as two stars. Such wonderful and terrible sounds I was hearing, he said. Some of them you would never wish to be hearing yourself, but some of them sound like glorious music. He seemed almost to be transfixed by the excitement of his thoughts. His face was beautiful in its blaze of emotions. Tell me some more about them, Sophie said quietly. You just ought to be hearing the little mice talking, he said. Little mice is always talking to each other, and I's always hearing loud as my own voice. What do they say? Sophie asked. Only the mice know that, he said. Spiders is also talking a great deal. You might not be thinking it, but spiders is the most tremendous natterboxes. But when they is spinning their web, they is singing all the time. They is singing sweeter than a nightingale. Who else do you hear? Sophie asked. One of the biggest chatterbugs are caterpillars. the BFG said. What do they say? They is arguing all the time about who's going to be the prettiest butterfly. That is all they ever talking about. Is there a dream floating around in here now? Sophie asked. The BFG moved his great ears this way and that way, listening softly. He shook his head. There's no dream in here, he said, except in the bottles. I has a special place to go catching dreams. They is not often come into drying country. How do you catch them? The same way you is catching butterflies, the BFG answered, with a net. He stood up and crossed over to the corner of the cave where the pole was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net at the end of it. Here is a dream catcher, he said, grasping the pole in one hand. Every morning, I is going out and snatching a dream and putting them in the bottle. Suddenly, he seemed to lose interest in the conversation. I's getting hungry, he said. It's time for eats. Snuzzcumbers. But if you don't eat people like all others, Sophie said, then what do you live on? This is the squelchy, tricky problem around here, the BFT answered. In this slosh-funkle giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pig wiggles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky-poo vegetable. It's called the snozzcumber. The snozzcumber, cried Sophie. There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square, white teeth. Yesterday, he said, we was not believing in giants, was we? Today, we is not believing in snozzcumbers. Just because we happen not to actually see something with our own two winkles, we think it doesn't exist. What about, for instance, great squizzly Scotch hoppers? I beg your pardon, Sophie said. And the humplecrimples. What's that? Sophie said. And the rousebacles. The what? Sophie said. And the crumbscuttles. Are they animals? Sophie asked. They is common animals, said the BFG. I is not very well known all giant myself, but it seems to me you is an absolutely know-nothing human being. Your brain is full of rotten wool. You mean cotton wool, Sophie said. What I mean is what I say is two different things, the BFG announced rather grandly. I will now show you snozzcumbers. The BFG flung open the massive cupboard and took out the weirdest looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long again as an ordinary man, but was much thicker. It was as thick as its girth as a perambular. It was black and white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobs. The snozzcumber, I wonder, would you try that? Pretty interesting. Here is a repulsant snozzcumber, cried the BFG, waving it about. I squoggled it. I despise it. I desponge it. But because I refuse to gobble up human beings like other giants, I must spend my life guzzling the icky-poo snozzcumbers instead. If I don't, I'll be nothing but skin and groans. You mean skin and bones, Sophie said. I know it's bones, the BFG said, but please understand that I cannot be helping it if I sometimes say things a little squiggly. I is trying my very best all the time. The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to be rude. There never was any school to teach me to talk in giant country, the BFG said sadly. But couldn't your mother have taught you? Sophie asked. My mother? Cried the BFG. Giants don't have mothers. Surely he's knowing that. I did not know that, Sophie said. Who ever heard of a woman giant? shouting the BFG, waving the snozcumber around his head like a lasso. There never was a woman giant, and there never will be one. Giants is always men. Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. In that case, she said, how were you born? Giants isn't born, the BFG answered. Giants appear, and that's all there is to it. They simply appear, the same way the sun and the stars do. And when did you appear? Sophie asked. Now, how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that? Said the BFG. It is so long ago, I couldn't count. You mean you don't even know how old you are? No giant is knowing that, the BFG said. All I is knowing about myself is that I is a very old, very, very old and crumply, perhaps as old as the earth. What happens when giants die? Sophie asked. Giants never die, the BFG answered. Sometimes, and quite suddenly, a giant is disappearing and nobody is knowing where he goes. But mostly us giants is simply going on and whistling time and twiddlers. The BFG was still holding the awesome snozcumber in his right hand. And now he put one end of his mouth on a bit of the hunk and hunked it off, like he was crunching the lump of ice. It's filthing, he sputtered, squeaking with his mouth, spraying full large pieces of snozcumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on one tabletop, ducking all the way. It's disgusting, the BFG said. It's sickable. It's rottensome. It's maggots-wise. Try it yourself. Try it, this snozcumber. No, thank you, Sophie said, backing away. It's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it, said the BFG. Go on, you snips a little bit. Here you go. Sophie took a small nibble. Oh, she sputtered. Oh, no. Oh, gosh. Help. She spat it out quickly. It tastes like frog skin, she gasped. And rotten fish. Worse than that, cried the BFG, roaring with laughter. To me, it tastes like clock couches and slime wanglers. Do we really have to eat it? Sophie said. You do, unless you wanted to become so thin you disappear into thin air. Into thin air? Sophie said. A thick air is something quite different. Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. Words, he said, is oh such a twinkling problem to me all my life. We're going to go ahead and stop right there. That's when they're trying the snozcumber, and it's gross. Would you try one? If you can make up any kind of vegetable, gross or tasty, what would you name it? Would you eat it? Would you encourage others to eat it? Write about it and let me know.